My name is Dave Glover. I'm a cloud developer advocate at Microsoft, and I'm based here in Sydney, Australia. The scenario is building a Raspberry Pi air quality monitor solution, and I'm using something called IoT Central, and I'll kind of give you a bit more context in a moment. This whole scenario is based on air quality. So I think a lot of you are based here in Sydney, Australia, and this was a photo I took from my balcony probably about 3 weeks ago at the height of the pandemic lockdown. And I'm sure you've all probably noticed the air quality across Sydney has been pretty decent, really nice. In fact, I've seen blue skies like we haven't seen for a long time. But if you remember back 6 months ago, at the height of the Australian bushfire, that across Sydney and really across a lot of cities, a lot of places across Australia, the air quality was pretty awful. And this is a photo taken from the same location. And you can see that Sydney is pretty much blanketed in smoke. And I set up this thing called a particulate matter sensor. And you can see that I was recording two levels of particulate matter. So the one which is called particulate matter 2.5, which is not a very good number, because this is the size of the particles that can actually be absorbed into your bloodstream. The PM10s, not so much. They just don't make the environment feel so great. So you can see here that at the height, I think this was on the 10th of the 12th of 2019, so just over 6 months ago, that the particulate matter there was close enough to 1,000, so 933, at a super dangerous level. And to kind of give you an idea what the kind of healthy levels are, it's kind of between 0 and 10 is kind of what we should be gunning for. And you can look at various monitors across the city at the moment from the New South Wales government, and you can kind of get a bit of a sense of what the air quality is like. But as you all know, the air quality is actually pretty good across Sydney at the moment, just really from the lack of transport. Now, when I built this solution, what I built it on was on a Raspberry Pi, and I'm using this thing called an Enviro Plus hat. And it has a sensor on it called a PMS 5003. And it's a special sensor on it. It's actually I think it's got a laser beam. And basically, it watches the size of the particles going across in front of the laser beam. And they can kind of count how many particles per cubic centimeter or something along those lines. And then so I was running a Python-based application on the Raspberry Pi and had that sensor attached to it. And then what I'm doing is I'm sending that information or the telemetry from that device across to IoT Central. And you can see over on the right-hand side, I've got IoT Central. And there I was just charting the data. Now, if you look at that data, the data is basically as of a couple of days ago, I think. So the data is actually not particularly interesting because you can see that the particulate matter recordings are pretty much zero, which is a great place to be, but not so interesting in terms of the data for the demo. And I've also pointed up there is that with IoT Central, you can sign up for free. There's a free trial. I'm going to show that in a moment. And you can also run 2 devices for free, kind of forever. Well, not necessarily forever, but for a long time. And so just kind of keep that in mind. Now, what I was going to do is just talk a bit about where IoT Central fits into the scheme of things inside Azure. So IoT Central is a solution or an application that Microsoft has built that makes it easy to go off and build IoT solutions, particularly the cloud side of an IoT solution. So things like reporting, data analysis, being able to extend it into other systems and things like that. So it's a solution in the same way that things like Office 365 is a solution. You just go and start using Outlook or Word or things like that. Azure IoT Central is the same, but it's for IoT solutions, and you just go away and basically define how your solution will look. But it is not the only thing that we have inside Azure for IoT, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things in here. So just in the middle, we have these kind of they're called solution accelerators, and they cover off kind of the majority or kind of a good subset of the kind of scenarios that we see for IoT. So there's remote monitoring, predictive maintenance, etc. And then down below in the bottom box, you'll see there's a whole range of solutions, so services. There's something called IoT Hub, IoT Edge. There's something device provisioning service. In the data area, there's Stream Analytics. There's Cosmos DB for visualization. There's Power BI, Microsoft Flow, and all those types of things. I'm not going to go into any of those other than to say that IoT Central is built on and uses IoT Hub under the covers, and it uses device provisioning service as part of that solution, and it also uses Azure Time Series insights. So just keep that in mind. Those are the services under that kind of underpin Azure IoT Central. And then just really, I just want to cover off like at a super high level, the kind of the anatomy of an IoT solution. So you normally have devices, and in this case, the device is going to be a Raspberry Pi. It could be a microcontroller. For that matter, it could be a mobile phone. I know a lot of IoT solutions which are actually talking directly into Azure, into IoT Hub. It could be a desktop computer kind of sending telemetry up as well. But normally it's some sort of device that's got some sensors attached to it. And then that information is going to be sent up securely up to IoT Hub. And then you would store it, or you'd stream it, or you'd analyze it. You might push that data into a machine learning model, for example, to go and train up machine learning. And the whole idea behind it is you've got things, you've kind of got insights, and you've got actions. And that action could be, hey, look, I'm monitoring the temperature of a refrigeration unit, and I want to send a message back to the refrigeration unit to say, hey, you need to reduce the temperature off of the device. So that's the kind of idea behind it. And as I said, underpinning IoT Central is fundamentally this model. Now, so just to kind of give you a bit of a sense of IoT Central. So one thing, it's fully managed. You don't have to go and set up anything. You just basically have to sign in and it's there. It's no code, so you don't have to go and write any code server side. It's basically a web application, and you go and define it. You can go and define things like rules and triggers. You can extend it. So as the data flows into IoT Central, you can go and do things like charting that data, but you can also extend it. So you might push that data into event hubs, or you might store that data into Azure storage, or things like that. And there's analytics, dashboards, and visualization. It's super easy to get up and running with, and that's what I'm going to kind of show you in a moment. And as I mentioned before, this is the chart, this is the data that I want to be able to get out of the device and chart this up. So the first thing I'm going to do is just go through a bit of a demonstration about how to go and build an IoT Central application. So the first place to go to start with is just go searching for Azure IoT Central and find it in your search engine of choice. Go and click on Build a Solution, and I'm already signed in, so My Apps, and I go and create a new application, a custom application. I just go and give it a name your app, and you can go and select free, put in your details, and go and click OK. And it typically takes around about 30 seconds to go and provision a new IoT Central application. Now, rather than us watching for that 30 seconds while it's doing that, I've basically created a trial already. And this is the free trial. You get 7 days, and then you can migrate it to run 2 devices for free on an ongoing basis. So the first thing you'll see that there's a dashboard, and you can go and customize that dashboard. And I'll try and give a bit of an idea on give you an example of how to customize it shortly as well. But the first thing what I'm going to do is set up a device template. Now, before I do that, I just want to bring up something. I've got Visual Studio Code over here. So you'll see inside Visual Studio Code, if you're familiar with JSON, this is a JSON string. And you can see in here that I've got temperature and humidity. Device name and humidity. And you can see I've got the value and things like that. So what I'm going to do, the reason I'm kind of explaining this up front is the way this works is that a device will send up to IoT Central a JSON string with a telemetry in it. And then what I'm going to do is map that JSON telemetry into IoT Central. And that's kind of what I'm going to do now. So I'm going to go in here and create a new device template. So I'm going to set up an IoT device, click on Customize, and we'll just go and call this Air Quality Monitor. Click on Review, click on Create. It takes a moment to go off and create that. Now, what I'm going to do is just go through and show you a couple of, a way in which you can go and create your own kind of custom model. So what I'm going to do here is add an interface, and we're going to make that a custom interface. And then I'm going to add in a model, basically a capability. And the first one, I'm just going to say temperature. In fact, just to keep it consistent, if I jump back to Visual Studio Code, you'll see that I've got temperature, and it's a lowercase t for temperature. And you just got to make sure that you have lowercase. In this case, I know I want the display name. I want that to be lowercase. It's to be of type telemetry, but can be a property or a command. And there's something called a semantic type, and you can go and say, I'm going to select temperature, and you can go and select, hey, look, it's a float, it's a double, it's an integer, it's a long. You can say, look, I want that in Celsius, and I want that to be a display unit to be C. And I can carry on doing this, and I just say this one here is humidity, and the same principle over here. Come over here, select humidity, and in this case here, it's percentage. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole process of doing this for all of them, so I'm just going to click on Save, and that's kind of fundamentally how you go and build these models. So what I'm doing in here is I'm mapping in the names here to the JSON document. In fact, this one was a lowercase. So jumping back over here, that's kind of what's going on. So I've got humidity and temperature, and that's been mapped to these names over here. Now I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to delete that template as well. And we'll just go through and create another one. So we'll go through here, and I'm going to call it Air Quality again, Air Quality Monitor. Click on Review, click on Create. Now this time I'm going to import a capability model, and you'll see this capability model in that on my GitHub in the project solution. And what I've done here is I've just imported in what I've already created before, but rather than you having to go through the pain of watching me going through setting up this capability model, I've kind of predefined one, and I've just imported it. And just so you can get a bit of a sense of what those look like, I'll just go over to my GitHub here. There's a JSON document, and you can see in here that capability model is just a JSON document, and you can come through here and you can modify it yourself as well. And you can see in here it's type telemetry, and you can see the schema type is integer. So you'll see double down there, etc. So that's kind of what's going on, and what how I created the template, the interface, and the capabilities on that interface. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a view, and I'm just going to go over here to visualize, and I'm just going to pick up on humidity, air pressure, and temperature. And then down the bottom here, you'll see add tile. And then the next thing I'm going to do is go and add in the particulate matter for 1.0. For some reason, actually, I think I've got a mistake. Oh no, that's 10 and 2.5, and add a tile for that. And I'm also going to add in one for message ID. Message ID is literally just an integer that just kind of gives me a sense of how many messages have been sent up to IoT Central. It's just a way of keeping tabs on that. And you can go and change this. So you'll see by default, it's a line chart. In this case here, I just want last known value. And I can go and change the size of that tile and just drag that over there. So it's all nicely lined up. So hopefully it kind of gives you a bit of an idea how these things work. And then when I've done that, I click on Save. And then the next thing I'm going to do is publish that template. So hopefully that kind of made sense how I did that. So I'm just publishing out the device, the interface, the capabilities, and that view that I created. So what I'm going to do now is go to Devices. and I'm going to come over here and I'm going to create a new device in IoT Central. I'm going to select air quality monitor, and I have a name that I'm going to use, so just bear with me. And display name I'm going to use is Raspberry Pi Enviro Plus, and we'll go off and create that. So what I've done now is I've created my first device inside IoT Central. And there are, by the way, ways in which you can automate this or kind of import lots of devices. But in this case, we're just going to keep it simple, and we just created one device. And you'll see that it's come up here and it's brought up that template that I've associated with this device. And obviously I haven't started the application yet, so there's no data to be shown. And the other thing I'm going to come up here is click on Connect. And then Connect, we're going to jump back to this in a moment. But you can see in here, I've got basically the connection information that I need for the device to connect into IoT Central. Because obviously, well, it is secure, and you need to configure the device with the credentials that you're going to be using to connect to IoT Central. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward. So I went and created a device template, went on there, I defined these properties, or these capabilities I should say, and these all map to this JSON document that's going to be this JSON string that's going to be sent from the device that I'm going to be creating in a moment. Okay, so I'm just going to jump back to the slides. So that's the IoT Central and how I created that. Okay, so the next bit I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how I built the Raspberry Pi solution using Visual Studio. Visual Studio Code. In fact, let me just fix that while I'm on there. That should say Visual Studio Code, because there is a distinction. And I'm using something called Remote SSH Development. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to be building a solution on a Raspberry Pi, and I've got the sensor here, and it's Wi-Fi connected into my home network, and that's how the data is going to be getting off this device and into the cloud. Now, the way I actually kind of run the solution is I actually built the solution on a Raspberry Pi version 4, which is a really capable device. But actually, when I ran the device, I actually ran it on a Raspberry Pi Zero. So I actually just took the sensor off the Raspberry Pi 4, deployed the solution on the Raspberry Pi Zero, and that literally just sat on my balcony. And it just sat there and chirped away. It was obviously doesn't use much power, and it's small, and it kind of doesn't get in the way. So it's pretty neat. So that's kind of what I did. Now, I mentioned before that I'm using Visual Studio Code remote development, and just to kind of give you a bit of an idea how this works. So if you've used Visual Studio Code already, you might have used it for building, I don't know, Python applications or C++ applications on the desktop, on your desktop computer, and it runs on Linux and Mac and Windows. With remote development, the way it works is we've kind of split out Visual Studio into two halves effectively. So there is one half which kind of runs on your desktop, which is kind of the UI. It's the thing that you're interacting with, the Visual Studio Code, you're writing your code and things like that. And then there's a remote element that runs on the remote device. And in this case, the remote aspect of Visual Studio Code is running on the Raspberry Pi. And it will manage the whole things like all the Visual Studio Code extensions, that will manage source code control or to manage debuggers, all that kind of thing. So even though in the demo that I'm going to do for you in a moment, it's going to look like I'm developing this on my desktop, what's really happening is I'm developing it on the Raspberry Pi, and I'll try and make that a bit more clear as I kind of get through this. And you can see here I've got Visual Studio Code, and down the very bottom on this slide here, you'll see that I basically have an SSH connection, but you're going to see this kind of an action in a moment. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump around the place, and the first thing I've got here is I've got an SSH window to terminal set up to my Raspberry Pi. So if I just go uname-a, you can see it's a Linux system. You can see it's Linux PyLab. It's the name I called this. You can see the kernel, so it's running on 4.19, and you can see it's running on an ARM. And if I go and do things like, if you're reasonably familiar with Linux systems, you can go and do things like that. And you can see, hey, look, this is running Buster, Raspberry Pi Linux, etc. And if I just go and do, there goes the file system on the Raspberry Pi. And I'm going to change directory into GitHub. We'll just do a clear on that. And you can see these are the directories in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into a directory called environment. And you can see that there go the files for the solution sitting on the Raspberry Pi. So that was just to give you a sense of when I'm building the solution, I'm building it on the Raspberry Pi. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start up Visual Studio. In fact, I'm actually going to shut it down first because I've already got it connected. Okay, so imagine I didn't have it already connected. So what I've done, and you'll see this in the tutorial, you'll see how to go and set this up. So I'm not going to go through this, but basically you need to go and set up an SSH certificate that you push onto the device. So basically manages the security between your desktop and, I don't think we're going to allow someone to have access to my desktop. So what I'm going to do, down the bottom here, this is the easiest way, you'll see there's this green greater than less than sign. And I'm going to connect to this remote SSH connect to host. And you'll see I've got a couple of devices here. I've got 2 Raspberry Pis, but the one that I want is this thing called Raspberry Pi 4B-Edge. And that starts up a new instance of Visual Studio. And the first thing I'm going to do, Visual Studio Code, the first thing I'm going to do is open the project. So I'm going to click on Open Folder. Now, what I want to kind of get across here is when I'm building this, I'm not opening a folder on my local system, on my local desktop Windows computer. I'm actually opening a folder on the Raspberry Pi. So you remember I had that folder called GitHub. And you remember I then navigated to a folder called Environment. And we're going to click on Open. OK for that. So what that's done now is that that's opening the solution on the Raspberry Pi. So the fantastic thing about this remote SSH development is it gives you a desktop experience for building solutions, but it's actually happening on the Raspberry Pi. You can also go and use it for you can also, by the way, use remote SSH for Docker and for other Linux systems. So WSL, for example, the Windows subsystem for Linux on Windows. And you'll see down here on the left-hand side, I'm hoping that you've already played around with Visual Studio Code, so you're going to get a bit of an idea how it works. But I've got a number of extensions. And normally when you're building this, you'll see that you'll normally have what are called local installed extensions. And you can see I've got a whole lot of extensions installed here locally. But if you can see down about halfway through my screen, you can see that I've got this SSH Raspberry Pi 4B Edge installed. And these are the extensions that are installed onto the Raspberry Pi. And if I just scroll down through here, you see I've got extensions in here for Docker. I've extensions here for JSON. I've got the Python. If I go and click on the Python and just go and highlight that, it'll say to you the extension is enabled on SSH. So the important thing about that is that this extension, this Visual Studio Code extension, is actually running on the Raspberry Pi and not on my desktop. So that's the beauty of this kind of remote SSH dev for Visual Studio Code. Now just make sure there aren't any questions. No, okay, that's cool. So now I've got the solution open. Now I'll just jump around a couple of other things as well. I'm going to show you this in a moment, but I've got a Docker extension installed as well. I've got GitHub, so this solution is also checked into GitHub. Whoops, so how about I click on the actual GitHub extension, so you can see these are the files that I've made changes to since the last time I checked it in. And if I go and click on the Explorer, you can see the files up here. And if I go to open main.py, you can see that this is the Python application that's the file that's on the Raspberry Pi. And you can see that I can just kind of scroll around that. I'm going to set a breakpoint over here. And you can see that I've got another class over here called sensor. And this sensor imports this thing called the PMS 5003. So that's the name of the air quality sensor that I've got attached to the Raspberry Pi. And then you can see there's just a bit of code in here. If you've done a bit of Python, you appreciate that's kind of the initialization for this class, or the constructor. And then the rest of it, there's just a bit of code in here that the way that I do it, I take a number of readings and then I average them. So you can see I think I'm taking 14 measurements and then just averaging those, just going to get a better value of that. And you can see what I'm doing when I get my average, I'm just dividing it by the number of samples. In fact, you can see it's 15. Taking 15. And then you can see I'm getting the temperature off the sensor as well. I'm getting the pressure and the humidity. And then a bit of other magic. And so that's pretty much how this solution's working. So we go back to main.py, which is the entry point for this application. Now you'll see down in here where I put a breakpoint, I've got some Python code in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab an environment variable called scope ID, another one called device ID, and another one called device key. And this information is basically the connection information that I need from IoT Central. So there's a special file over here called .env. And you can see I've got this information in here. Now this information is actually out of date because it was for a previous version of IoT Central that I had set up. So I'm going to jump back to IoT Central. Oh, that's not good. I have no idea why it's doing that. You do not have permission to create this action. I think we'll just close that. And I won't panic because I'm sure it'll work. And I've got a number of apps, so I'll just go and create the one, just jump to the one that I created. I think it was that one. Look at the template. Look at the device. Okay, we're all good. A moment of panic. Go and click on connect. And you'll see I've got on here scope ID. So I'm going to grab that scope ID, come back over to the application. I'm just going to paste that in. The device ID is the same. You probably saw I used a pre-canned one. So that's the same. And then I want this key. I'm going to close that. And I'm just going to replace this key over here with that. So what I'm doing here is these are just the credentials that I'm putting onto the Raspberry Pi Python application. It needs those to be able to securely connect to IoT Central. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start this application. So over here on the debug, I'm just going to make sure I can either do a remote attach or I can attach the current file. And I'm just going to run that, and then I'm going to press F5. And what this is going to do is this is going to start up this application, and you can see that it's now hit the breakpoint inside the Python application. And if I step over this, you can see in a moment, if I go and hover over scope ID, you'll see it's got the scope ID from IoT Central. So remember, that's just that value there. So keep in mind that was, it ends in 4498. So if I hover over that, we should see 4498. The device ID, as we know, is Raspberry Pi Envario Plus, and there's that key, which none of us are going to remember. And we'll just keep going through that. I'm just going to get rid of that breakpoint. And further down here, I'm just going to set a breakpoint. In fact, I'm going to set a breakpoint over in the sensor, and I'm going to set a breakpoint there. So this code is going to be called in a moment. So I'm just going to hit run. And this will basically provision that connection, what's called do a provision. So it gets me the connection string. And then it will connect. And in a moment, he says, it will call now for some reason it's not hit the breakpoint. Okay, there it goes. Okay, so it's hit the breakpoint. Now that delay was just the first time the delay. What it was doing is it was talking to IoT Central, passing across those credentials. Then under the covers, what was being sent back was a connection string. So it was just a bit of negotiation going on there. And then I can just step through this. And as I said before, this is going to do this and measure this 15 times. So it's actually going to hang in there for about 15 seconds because I've got a sleep for 1 second. And then perhaps we'll put a breakpoint there. So we'll see that coming out of that breakpoint, out of that loop. And in a moment, there we are, it's hit that breakpoint. In fact, I'll just get rid of that breakpoint, so we're not to confuse me in a moment. And what you'll see is it's now sending up the telemetry up to IoT Central. And you remember I said it was going to be sending up a JSON string. So this is a JSON string that's going up to IoT Central. And remember I had that template, and that template had those capabilities that were mapping the JSON string keys basically to the capabilities inside IoT Central. And I'll jump back to main.py, and you can see that this application here basically sends telemetry every 2 seconds. Now this is way too much. For this sensor, it actually doesn't like being read more than like once every 10 minutes. And you'll see some logic in here that I actually stop this sensor here. I'm trying to remember what I did, but yeah, you can see I'm hanging in there for 10 minutes, 10 times 60 seconds. That's just to stop that sensor because you can damage that sensor if you read it too much. Okay, so we've now got the data streaming up to IoT Central. So what we're going to do now is jump over to IoT Central, and in a moment, come across over here, and you can start to see that the data is flowing into IoT Central. Now, IoT Central, though that data is going straight up into the system, IoT Central has like a cadence. It doesn't update immediately. It'll update every minute to a couple of minutes. So that data is now kind of going up there. And while it's going through there, I'm just going to jump around IoT Central and just kind of show you some things you can do while we're in here. So you can go and set up rules. So I can go and define a rule here, and I can go and select the template. And then I can go and select telemetry. And then, for example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if the temperature is greater than, let's just say 30 degrees, then I'm going to invoke some sort of action. It could be, for example, an email. And I might want to go and send an email to somebody to say, hey, look, did you know that the temperature in this room is greater than 30 degrees? Or what I could also do is I can go and set up what's called a webhook. And this is an extensibility mechanism, and you can extend these into Azure Functions, something Microsoft Flow or Logic Apps, or your own application for that matter. So it provides a really cool way of being able to extend the flow of data from the device into IoT Central, and then kind of extending that data into your own systems that you might want to go and do. You can also export the data. So we'll just say discard to that. I can export the data. So as the data is flowing into IoT Central, I can also go and export that data straight into storage, for example. And the reason you might want to go and put that data into storage, you might want to go and use the data for training machine learning model, be an obvious example. Or the other reason you might want to do it is for an audit. You might have a customer, or you might be building a solution for a customer, and that customer says, look, I want to know everything that's come from that device. And a really cheap way of keeping that data that's come from that device is into storage. If I jump back to devices and go to the Raspberry Pi Envario Plus, you'll see that now there's a bit of extra data that's coming through. And though there's not quite enough data in here, there might be just enough. There's also analytics. So I come into here, air quality monitor. I can select the telemetry, in this case temperature. Go and click on Analyze, and there's really not enough data in this. But what this enables me to do, if I go and select this and zoom in, you can see here that I can zoom into that data. Now, the reality is I've only got a couple of minutes of data in here, but you can imagine you might have a lot of data that's flowing into the system, and you're trying to figure out there's an issue somewhere, and you know that this happened, in this period. And you want to drill into that data. So you kind of get that. So this is actually time series insights that's doing this has been exposed up through IoT Central. So hopefully it kind of gives you a sense of most of the things you can do. You can also do these things called jobs. And in this case, it doesn't make too much sense because I've already only got data flowing up into IoT Central. But you can also control devices from IoT Central. And so, for example, I might have a relay that's sitting on this Raspberry Pi. And let's say I've got a whole lot of Raspberry Pis and I want to turn the lights off. Or I want to turn the relays off. You could go and create a job which says, hey, look, send a message out to all those devices and turn the lights off. That's the kind of idea. There's also administration here, and you can go and customize it. You can go and select an image that, hey, this application is doing, you can kind of brand the application. You can also come in through here, and I'm just trying to remember where you do this. You can go and customize the application, so you can select an image. You can go and change colors and things like that. So you can do lots of customization to kind of make it look a bit more your own. As I mentioned before, you can go and play around the dashboard as well. So if I go and edit this dashboard, I want to get rid of that. And in this case here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add in some more telemetry. And I'm going to select a device, the Raspberry Pi, and I'm just going to pick on temperature again. And why don't I, given this is we've got the particulate matter sensor, we're going to add a tile for that. And there you can have that in the same. So you can kind of keep stuff that you're interested in, that you want to be, without having, whoops, we'll just save that. And you can see rather than having to go to devices, then drill down into the device, you can just go across the dashboard. And there you've got that kind of quick way to get at that solution. And again, if I go into analytics, there might be a little bit more data that's sitting inside there that might make that a little bit more interesting. No, there's not really enough data in there. So anyway, that kind of gives you hopefully a bit of a sense of how you can use IoT Central and the Raspberry Pi and Visual Studio Code all together.